quite easy as we think about that story to think of it in terms of the collection on Sunday morning. People giving different sums for the various purposes that collections are taken for in churches. It's no disrespect to the way churches operate these days to remind ourselves that the temple was a little bit more than just a church. The Jews of Jesus' time thought of the temple as a sign of creation itself in harmony with God. The enormous basin of water in the main courtyard represented the primordial waters out of which creation had been drawn. The veil in front of the sanctuary was embroidered with pictures of all kinds of different life. It represented the whole variety of the created world. And in the middle of it all was the silence and the emptiness of the Holy of Holies, where the glory of God dwelt. Just as in silence and stillness, at the very heart of creation, is the glory of God. So the temple was a kind of living symbol of the world in harmony with God. The maintenance of worship in the temple was a matter of keeping alive the connection between that fundamental vision of the world in God's presence and the daily reality in which people live. All of which means that there's a little bit more going on in this story than simply how much money somebody puts in the plate. The wealthy, who give their large and very visible donations to the temple, give, says Jesus, out of their abundance. The restoration of the world is an extra. It's something you come to when you've done all the more important things, like making money and making yourself comfortable. Oh, and yes, incidentally, it would be quite nice if the will of God were done in the world. So let's put something from my pocket into that. They give out of their abundance, out of what is extra, out of the unnecessary. And the widow gives what she has to live on. She gives because for her, living and restoring the relation of God to the world are bound up together. Like the prophets we've been thinking about in the retreat this week, she cannot stop herself pouring out what she is, her life, her commitment, her passion, into the restoration of the world. The healing of the world, what Jewish thinkers call the tikkun olam, the restoration of the everything. The healing of the world is for her a matter of life and death. She can't stop herself pouring all that she has, which is not much, into that vision of restoration. So that part of what Jesus is saying in this story is a challenge to how deeply the restoration of the world matters to us. Can we give what we live on? Can we give the center of our desire, our passion and our longing to that vision of a restored world? Can we live in the hope of profound, inclusive renewal of all relationships, our relationships to one another, our relationships with the material world itself? Can we give of that, giving of our substance, as the old translations put it? Or is all that a bit of an extra? Lots more interesting things to think about, and then maybe, if we've got a bit of spare time, and a bit of spare cash we might want to invest in the renewal of creation. I very much suspect that you, like me, are stuck in exactly that mindset most of the time. There are urgent, interesting, even important things to do, and yes, if we have a bit of time and energy left over, we might invest a little bit in the restoring of creation. And Jesus, as always, merciful and merciless at the same time, says to us, I'm sorry, but that's actually not going to be good enough in the long run. But I know your failures, I know your struggles, I know your pressures. I am going to pay out of my poverty all that I have and all that I am for the restoration of the world. And maybe when you see me paying into the treasury what is needed for the restoration of the world, maybe when you see love in that depth, maybe you might think it possible after all. So we struggle with that sense of being confronted with a Jesus who, like the widow, pays all that he has so that the world may be healed. Not in the sense of simply clearing the debt that we can't ourselves pay, but making a gift of all that is needed to breach the gaps, to heal the wounds in the world. And here, at the table of Jesus, we are reminded of the depth and completeness of that gift. Jesus paying over into our lives his very substance. Because, like God, whose life Jesus embodies, Jesus can give nothing but his own love at the end of the day. That's his poverty. Nothing else he can give us. Success, happiness, all the rest of it. No, he can give himself. He can give his love. That's what he gives, out of his poverty. All that he has, all that he lives by. The widow giving her last penny so that there may be a sign on earth of the restoration of creation. The widow points us back to Jesus himself. So there is our gift. There is our challenge. Later in this service, something very small and round, like a coin, will be placed into our hands. Maybe as we receive that gift, we can think, that is Jesus' payment to us for restoration. Given out of poverty, given out of the fact that Jesus, like his heavenly Father, can give nothing but himself and nothing but his love. As we receive, are we ready to engage with that kind of love? Recognizing what we can and can't give, struggling day by day to make our gift of love and service something more than just a pleasant, pious decoration to all the more important things in life, but something which recognizes that our life, our own life, lies in the restoration of all things, in being swept up into God's great act of healing, reconciliation, making whole, tikkun olam, remaking all that is. And there's one final thought that comes to mind in the wake of that. All of us this morning will be aware of what's happening on the other side of the Atlantic. All of us will be aware of the shadows that gather not only over the United States, but over many, many other nations and communities as well. And as we look at the strange sequence of circumstances that have brought us to this point, one thing that does emerge is the image of what a world looks like when communication, economics, hopes, fears and dreams are all dictated simply by the needs of the very wealthy. It's a brutally simple thing to say, but part of what has been happening in the last months in the United States has been an extraordinary explosion of the investment of the fabulously rich in maintaining their position and their power. These are not necessarily evil individuals. They are people swept up in a system of power and control which will inevitably work against the most vulnerable. People for whom the restoration of the world is presumably not a matter of life and death. And to say that is not to point a finger, but to recognize in ourselves, all of us who are members of this society, the ways in which we again and again allow that sort of distorted vision, that sort of narrow priority to prevail and decide for us. We can't defeat that kind of massive, ingrained evil simply by pushing back with violence and rejection. We defeat it finally, and how far away that finally can sometimes seem. We defeat it finally by being Christ-like. We defeat it finally by uniting ourselves with Christ's payment of love. That is, to recognize that our life, as the monastic saint of the 4th century said, our life and our death lie with our neighbour. Our life and our death are not our own individual business under our control. That our life belongs with the life of the world around us and the life of the people around us. That in that deep belonging and our yielding to that belonging, renewal happens. Christ changes the world by belonging with us at a level we can barely imagine. Christ changes the world by belonging with us. We change by learning how to belong more deeply with one another. That belonging may be costly, but it's done for the sake of the temple, for the sake of there being in the world a community that speaks of the restoration of all things. The great bronze sea in front of the sanctuary, the curtain displaying all the varieties of created life, the mystery at the heart of things. We seek to live as a church in a way that brings all those things into light. And we can do that only by paying over our small sums, our microscopic hearts and desires, as best we can, into the whole process of God's healing work, from beginning to end of creation. That process whose heart and centre lies in the life and death and resurrection of the one whose table we share here, the one whose poverty we receive in our hands, whose wealth makes us all live as creatures together in the great community of what has been